Billionaire saw his father crying in the black maid's arms. Then she exposed a hidden truth. The marble floors of the Morrison mansion gleamed like ice under the crystal chandeliers, reflecting the cold perfection that Thomas Morrison demanded from every corner of his empire. But on this particular evening, something was different. The usual silence that wrapped around the estate like a shroud was broken by a sound that made 32-year-old billionaire James Morrison stop dead in his tracks. It was the sound of crying, deep and broken, coming from the West Wing where his father Thomas lived. James had come home early from a board meeting in Singapore, planning to surprise his father for his 78th birthday tomorrow. But as he walked through the hallway lined with oil paintings of Morrison ancestors, all stern-faced men who built their fortune in steel and railways, he heard that sound that made his blood run cold. His father, the man who never showed weakness, who taught James that emotions were for the poor and desperate, was sobbing like a child. James quickened his pace, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble with sharp authority. The crying grew louder as he approached his father's private study, and then he heard another voice, soft and comforting, speaking words he couldn't quite make out. He pushed open the heavy oak door without knocking, and what he saw made him freeze in the doorway. There was his father, Thomas Morrison, the man who controlled a business empire worth billions, collapsed in the arms of Grace Washington, their housemaid. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and hands that had spent 30 years serving the Morrison family, and she was holding his father like a mother holds a frightened child. Thomas's face was buried in her shoulder, his whole body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and ancient inside him. Grace's dark arms wrapped around him protectively, one hand gently stroking his silver hair while she whispered something that sounded like a lullaby. "What the hell is going on here?" James's voice exploded through the room like thunder. Both Grace and Thomas looked up, startled. Thomas tried to pull away, to compose himself, but he was too weak, too broken in that moment to manage his usual cold dignity. Grace didn't let go immediately. She held Thomas for another second, as if protecting him from his own son's anger, before slowly helping him sit back in his leather chair. "Mr. James," Grace said, her voice steady despite the fury radiating from the young billionaire. "Your father was having a difficult moment. I was just trying to help." James stepped into the room, his face twisted with disgust and confusion. "Help? You call this helping? You're a maid, not his therapist. You have no right to touch him like that." His voice was sharp enough to cut glass, each word dripping with the kind of contempt he usually reserved for business rivals. Thomas tried to speak, his voice hoarse from crying. "James, please, it's not what you think. Grace was just—" But James cut him off with a gesture so violent it made Grace flinch. "I don't want to hear it, Father. This is inappropriate. Completely inappropriate." He turned to Grace, his blue eyes cold as winter. "You're fired. Pack your things and leave. Tonight." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Grace stood slowly, her dignity intact despite the harsh dismissal. She had been with the Morrison family since James was 2 years old. She had watched him grow from a sweet little boy into this hard, angry man. She had made his favorite chocolate chip cookies when he was sad, had stayed up with him when he had nightmares, had been more of a mother to him than his own mother who died when he was 10. But now he looked at her like she was a stranger, worse than a stranger, like she was something dirty that needed to be removed from his perfect world. "Mr. James," Grace said quietly, "there are things you don't understand, things about your father, about this family, that you need to know." James laughed, but it was a harsh sound without any joy. "The only thing I need to know is that you've crossed a line. My father is Thomas Morrison. He doesn't need comfort from the help. He doesn't need anything from someone like you." The words, "someone like you," hung in the air, heavy with meaning that everyone in the room understood. Grace had faced this kind of prejudice her whole life, had learned to navigate around it like walking through a minefield. But this time, something in her shifted. Maybe it was the 30 years of loyal service. Maybe it was the secrets she had kept for so long. Or maybe it was just the sight of James, the boy she had helped raise, speaking to her with such cruelty. Whatever it was, Grace Washington decided in that moment that the truth needed to come out. Someone like me. Grace repeated, her voice gaining strength. You mean someone black? Someone poor? Someone who actually cares about your father instead of just his money? James's face reddened with anger. How dare you speak to me like that in my own home? But Grace wasn't backing down. This isn't just your home, Mr. James. This is a house built on lies. And I've been keeping those lies for too long. Thomas suddenly struggled to his feet, reaching out toward Grace. No, Grace, please don't. Not like this. But Grace turned to him with tears in her eyes. I'm sorry, Mr. Thomas, but he needs to know. The truth has been eating you alive for years. Look at you. You're dying inside because of it. James looked between them, confusion mixing with his anger. What truth? What are you talking about? Grace reached into her apron pocket and pulled out an old photograph, yellowed with age. She held it out to James with a steady hand. This is your truth, Mr. James. This is what your father has been hiding for 40 years. James snatched the photo from her hand, ready to tear it up, but then he saw what was in the picture. It was a young woman, beautiful, with dark skin and a brilliant smile, holding a baby in her arms. She was standing next to a much younger Thomas Morrison, who had his arm around her shoulders and was looking at her with pure love in his eyes. James stared at the photo, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. Who is this? He asked, though somehow, deep in his gut, he already knew. That's my sister, Lily, Grace said softly. And that baby she's holding? That's you, Mr. James, your real mother. The words hit James like a physical blow. He actually stumbled backward, catching himself on the doorframe. No, he said, shaking his head. No, that's impossible. My mother was Catherine Morrison. She died when I was 10. There are pictures, documents. But even as he said it, he was looking at the photo again, seeing something in that baby's face. Something familiar. Thomas sank back into his chair, covering his face with his hands. I'm so sorry, James. I'm so sorry for everything. The room seemed to spin around James as Grace continued talking, her voice steady and clear. Your father fell in love with my sister when she was working as a nurse at the hospital where he was recovering from a car accident. This was 1991, and a white billionaire couldn't marry a black woman without destroying his business empire. His board of directors, his society friends, they would have ruined him. So he kept Lily a secret. When she got pregnant with you, he promised her he would leave everything behind and start fresh somewhere else. But then Lily died giving birth to you. Grace's voice cracked slightly, but she continued. She died believing Thomas would do the right thing, would claim you as his son regardless of what society thought. But he didn't. He was too afraid of losing his fortune, his status. So he made up a story about adopting you as a baby after his wife Catherine couldn't have children. Catherine agreed to pretend to be your mother because she wanted a child so badly. James felt like the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about himself, about his family, was crumbling like a house of cards. But the birth certificate, he said weakly. The photos of Catherine pregnant. Thomas finally looked up, his face streaked with tears. All fake, he admitted. I had enough money to make any lie look like truth. Birth certificates can be forged, photos can be doctored. I created an entire false history because I was too much of a coward to admit I had a child with a black woman. Grace stepped closer to James, her eyes full of a pain that had been carried for decades. I've been working in this house, watching you grow up, because I promised my sister on her deathbed that I would make sure you were okay. She made me promise to watch over you, even if I couldn't tell you who you really were. For 30 years, I've been here, watching you turn into exactly the kind of person your father wanted you to be. Cold, prejudiced, caring only about money and status. And it broke my heart every single day because you're nothing like your mother. Lily was warm and kind and saw the good in everyone. She would be so disappointed to see what you've become. The words cut James deeper than any business loss ever could. He looked at the photo again, at the woman who was apparently his real mother, and something inside him cracked open. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. All these years, why didn't anyone tell me? Thomas stood up shakily, reaching out toward his son. I wanted to protect you," he said. "I thought if you never knew, you could live a normal life, have every advantage." But James pulled away from him. "Protect me? You stole my identity. You made me believe lies my entire life. And worse, you made me treat my own aunt like she was beneath me." The truth of it all came crashing down on James like a wave. Every time he had spoken dismissively to Grace, every time he had treated her like she was just the help, he had been insulting his own family, his own blood. He thought about all the moments Grace had been there for him over the years. When he was 7 and had broken his arm falling from a tree, it was Grace who had held him while they waited for the ambulance, singing softly to calm his fears. When he was 15 and his girlfriend had broken up with him, it was Grace who had found him crying in the garden and had sat with him without saying a word, just being present. When he graduated from Harvard Business School, she had been there in the back of the audience, clapping proudly, even though he had barely acknowledged her presence. "Oh, God," James said, sinking into a chair. "Oh, God, what have I done?" He looked up at Grace, seeing her properly for the first time in years. Not as the maid, but as a person, as family. "You're my aunt. You're my mother's sister, and I just fired you. I just spoke to you like you were nothing." Grace's expression softened slightly. "You didn't know, Mr. James. How could you know when everyone around you was committed to the lie?" But James shook his head. "No, that's not an excuse. Even if you weren't my aunt, I had no right to speak to you that way. No right to treat you as less than human just because you work here." He stood up suddenly, pacing the room like a caged animal. "My whole life is a lie. Everything I believed about myself, about my family, about who I am, it's all fake." He turned to his father with fury in his eyes. "How could you do this? How could you deny my mother? Deny who I really am just to protect your money?" Thomas seemed to age 10 years in that moment. "I was young and stupid and scared," he said. "My own father would have disowned me. The board would have forced me out. I told myself I was doing it for you, so you could have every opportunity, every advantage in life. But the truth is, I was a coward. I chose money over love, chose society's approval over doing what was right, and it's been eating me alive ever since." He looked at Grace with such sorrow in his eyes. "That's why I was crying when James found us. Today would have been Lily's 55th birthday. Every year on this day, the weight of what I did becomes unbearable. Grace is the only one who understands, the only one who remembers Lily like I do." James felt his whole world view shifting, like tectonic plates grinding against each other. He had built his entire identity on being a Morrison, on being white, on being part of the elite. He had looked down on people like Grace without even realizing he was looking down on his own heritage. "Tell me about her," he said suddenly, looking at Grace. "Tell me about my mother. My real mother." Grace's face transformed with a sad smile. "Lily was the most beautiful soul you could ever meet. She had this laugh that could light up a room. She loved to sing, had a voice like an angel. She was brilliant, too, graduated top of her nursing class. She wanted to open free clinics in poor neighborhoods, wanted to help people who couldn't afford health care." Grace walked to the window, looking out at the manicured gardens. She loved your father genuinely, not for his money but for who she thought he was. She believed he would choose love over everything else. When she found out she was pregnant with you, she was so happy. She said you were going to change everything, that you would bring both worlds together. Tears were running down James's face now, tears he didn't even try to stop. "She died because of me. She died giving birth to me." Grace turned back to him, her expression fierce. "No, Mr. James, she died bringing you into this world, and she considered it worth it. The last thing she said was that you were perfect, that you were going to do great things. She made me promise to make sure you knew you were loved, even if I couldn't tell you it was from her." James stood up and walked to Grace, and for the first time in his adult life, he hugged her. Really hugged her, not the awkward pat he might give at Christmas, but a real embrace. Grace stiffened in surprise, then slowly relaxed, patting his back like she used to when he was small. "I'm so sorry," James whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything, for how I've treated you, for who I've become, for dishonoring my mother's memory without even knowing it." When they finally pulled apart, James turned to his father. "We're going to make this right," he said, his voice gaining strength. "We're going to tell the truth, all of it. To everyone." Thomas's face went pale. "James, you don't understand what that will mean. The scandal, the business implications, your inheritance." But James cut him off. "I don't care about any of that. Not anymore. I've been living a lie, making decisions based on that lie, treating people based on that lie. It ends now." He walked to his father's desk and picked up the phone. "What are you doing?" Thomas asked, panic in his voice. "I'm calling a press conference," James said. "Tomorrow morning. We're going to tell the truth about everything. About my mother, about the lies, about how this family really built its fortune on the back of denying its own blood." Thomas slumped in his chair. "This will destroy everything I've built." James looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. "No, Dad, it will destroy everything you built on lies. Maybe something better can grow from the truth." The next morning, the Morrison mansion was surrounded by media vans and reporters. Word had leaked that James Morrison, one of the youngest billionaires in America, was making a major announcement. Everyone expected it to be about a new business venture or maybe a political run. Nobody expected what actually happened. James stood at the podium they had set up in the main ballroom, looking out at the sea of cameras and reporters. Grace stood to his right and his father sat in a chair to his left, looking like he might faint at any moment. "Thank you all for coming," James began, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside him. "I've called you here today to correct a lie that has been the foundation of my family for 32 years. I am not who you think I am. More importantly, I am not who I thought I was." He took a deep breath. "My mother was not Catherine Morrison. My mother was Lily Washington, a black woman who died giving birth to me. She was hidden, erased from history, because my father was too afraid of losing his status and fortune to acknowledge their relationship and their child." The room erupted in gasps and shouted questions, but James held up his hand for silence. "This woman standing beside me is Grace Washington. You know her as our housemaid, someone who has been invisible in this house for 30 years. But she is my aunt, my mother's sister, and she has spent 3 decades watching over me while being treated as less than human by the very family she was protecting." He turned to Grace, tears visible in his eyes. "I want to publicly apologize to Grace Washington for every moment of disrespect, every dismissive word, every time I failed to see her as the remarkable woman she is. She kept a promise to my dying mother to watch over me, even when I didn't deserve it." Grace stepped forward to the microphone, her voice clear and strong. "I don't want apologies," she said. "I want change. I want the truth to mean something. For 30 years, I've watched this family live in a prison of their own making, all because they were afraid of what people would think. But the truth is, love doesn't care about color or status or bank accounts. My sister loved Thomas Morrison, and he loved her, but fear won over love. Fear of judgment, fear of losing money, fear of being seen as different. That fear has poisoned this family for 3 decades. She looked directly into the cameras. There are so many families living with secrets like this. So many people denied their true heritage because someone decided they weren't the right color or class. Today, we're ending that for the Morrison family. But I hope other families watching this will find the courage to end their own lies too." Thomas finally stood up, shuffling to the microphone. He looked older than his 78 years, but there was something different in his eyes. Relief, maybe. "I have lived with this guilt for 32 years, he said, his voice shaking. "I denied the woman I loved most in this world because I was a coward. I denied my son his true identity because I thought money and status were more important than truth. I was wrong. I was catastrophically, unforgivably wrong." He turned to James. "Your mother would be proud of the courage you're showing today, the courage I never had." The press conference continued for another hour, with questions flying and revelations pouring out. By the end, the Morrison family as the world knew it had ceased to exist. But something new was being born from the ashes of the old lies. Over the next weeks, there was indeed scandal. Some business partners pulled out, Society friends distanced themselves, and the family name was dragged through countless news cycles. But James found he didn't care. For the first time in his life, he felt free. He legally changed his name to James Morrison Washington, honoring both sides of his heritage. He set up a foundation in Lily Washington's name to provide free health care in underserved communities, fulfilling the dream his mother never got to achieve. And he made Grace the foundation's honorary chair, finally giving her the respect and position she had always deserved. The Morrison mansion was transformed too. No longer a cold monument to wealth and status, it became a center for community programs. The ballroom, where James had revealed the truth, now hosted free classes for local kids. The gardens where Grace had once worked as a servant were open to the public. Thomas, freed from the weight of his secret, spent his remaining years trying to make amends. He worked with James and Grace on the foundation, using his business connections for good for the first time in decades. He never fully forgave himself for what he had done, but he found a kind of peace in finally living truthfully. 3 years after the revelation, James stood in the cemetery beside 2 graves. One was new, bearing Thomas Morrison's name. He had died peacefully in his sleep, with Grace holding his hand. The other was older, recently updated with a new headstone that read, Lily Washington Morrison, beloved mother, sister, and light of truth. James placed flowers on both graves, then stood back. Grace stood beside him, older now, but still strong. She would be proud of you, Grace said softly. You chose truth over comfort, love over fear. That's all she ever wanted. James put his arm around his aunt, this woman who had been his guardian angel even when he couldn't see it. Thank you, he said, for everything. For keeping your promise, for protecting me, for having the courage to finally tell the truth. Grace smiled, the kind of smile that held 30 years of pain and love and sacrifice. Family protects family, she said simply. Even when they don't know their family. Even when they don't deserve it. That's what love does. They stood there together, aunt and nephew, finally united in truth. The Morrison Empire might have been built on lies, but the Morrison-Washington legacy would be built on something stronger. Truth, love, and the courage to claim your whole self, no matter what the world thinks. As they walked away from the cemetery, James thought about the moment that had started it all, walking into his father's study and seeing him crying in Grace's arms. That image, which had once filled him with disgust and confusion, now made perfect sense. His father had been crying for all the love he had denied, all the truth he had buried, and Grace had held him because that's what family does, even when that family has denied you, even when they've made you invisible. They hold you when you break. The story of the billionaire who saw his father crying in the black maid's arms became legend in their city. But for James, Grace, and the memory of Lily Washington, it was more than a story. It was a reckoning, a redemption, and ultimately a resurrection of a family that had been buried under decades of lies. The truth hadn't been easy, but it had set them free. And in that freedom, they found something worth more than all the money in the Morrison accounts. They found themselves, their real selves, and the love that had been waiting there all along. Years later, when James would tell this story to his own children, mixed-race kids who would never have to hide who they were, he would always end it the same way. Your grandmother Lily died believing love would win over fear, he would say. It took 32 years, but she was right. Love did win. It just needed someone brave enough to choose it. And he would look at the photo on the mantel, the one Grace had kept hidden for so long, of Lily holding baby James. And he would see not a scandal or a secret, but a beginning. The beginning of a truth that would echo through generations, reminding them that no amount of money or status is worth denying who you really are. The Morrison-Washington family thrived, not in spite of the truth, but because of it. They became known not for their wealth, but for their work, not for their status, but for their service. And Grace Washington, who had spent 30 years being invisible, became the most visible and celebrated member of the family. She lived to be 93, spending her last decades traveling the world, speaking about the importance of truth and the danger of secrets. When she finally passed, thousands came to her funeral. Not because she had been a maid in a mansion, but because she had been a keeper of truth in a world full of lies. James spoke at her funeral, his hair gray now, his face lined with years of genuine living. "Grace Washington saved our family," he said to the packed church. "Not by keeping our secrets, but by finally revealing them. She showed us that the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than the most comfortable lie. She taught us that family isn't about blood or color or class. It's about showing up, staying present, and loving people even when they don't deserve it, especially when they don't deserve it." The legacy of that moment when a billionaire saw his father crying in the black maid's arms rippled out far beyond the Morrison family. Other families came forward with their own hidden truths. DNA tests revealed secret histories. Archives were opened. Stories were told. A whole generation decided that living authentically was worth more than maintaining appearances. And at the center of it all was the memory of Lily Washington, a woman who had been erased but refused to stay buried, and Grace Washington, who had carried the truth like a torch through 30 years of darkness. The Morrison Mansion still stands today, converted into the Lily Washington Memorial Medical Center, providing free health care to anyone who needs it. In the lobby, there are 3 portraits. Thomas Morrison, painted not as the cold businessman he had pretended to be, but as the broken man learning to heal. Grace Washington, painted not as a maid, but as the matriarch she always was. And Lily Washington, painted from the only photograph that exists of her, holding her baby and smiling with a joy that transcends time. Underneath the portraits is a plaque that reads, "Truth is the foundation of freedom. Love is the architecture of family. And courage is the bridge between what was and what should be." Every day, hundreds of people walk past those portraits, many not knowing the full story. But for those who do know, for those who remember the press conference that changed everything, those portraits are more than art. They're proof that it's never too late to tell the truth, never too late to make things right, and never too late to recognize that the people we overlook might be the very ones holding us together. The story of Billionaire saw his father crying in the black maid's arms, then she exposed a hidden truth, became more than a scandal or a revelation. It became a mirror for a society that had built itself on comfortable lies. And in that mirror, many people saw themselves clearly for the first time. Some turned away, unable to face what they saw, but others, inspired by Grace's courage and James's transformation, stepped forward into their own truth. And slowly, family by family, truth by truth, the world became a little more honest, a little more whole, and a lot more free.